August 1942. The Solomon Islands lay shrouded in mist and rain, a world of insects, mud, and unseen movement. To the Japanese soldiers who had conquered half the Pacific, Guadalcanal looked like just another jungle-covered island to be taken and held. They did not yet know that it would become their grave. When the first American Marines landed, the Japanese believed them to be few in number, poorly trained, untested, unprepared for the tropics. But as weeks turned into months, the reality became horrifyingly clear. These men did not retreat. They did not surrender. They fought through malaria, monsoon, and starvation with a relentless calm that unnerved even the veterans of China and Manchuria. To the Japanese Imperial Army, Guadalcanal was not just a defeat. It was the moment they realized that the United States was fighting a different kind of war, one powered by supply ships, airfields, and endless endurance. The island would devour them all. By mid-1942, Japan stood at the height of its empire. From the jungles of Burma to the coral atolls of the Central Pacific, the rising sun flew over territory larger than all of Western Europe combined. The Imperial Army had never known defeat. Its soldiers believed themselves invincible, warriors of the Emperor, fighting with divine purpose and unbreakable spirit. But that summer, a small, jungle-covered island in the Solomon chain would begin to tear that illusion apart. The island was called Guadalcanal. Barely 60 miles long, it was one of hundreds scattered across the Pacific. To most Japanese officers, it was little more than an uninhabited backwater. But to the United States, it was the key to stopping Japan's expansion and protecting the lifeline between Hawaii and Australia. After the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had swept southward, capturing bases and building airfields to threaten Allied shipping. In July 1942, reconnaissance flights revealed that Japan was constructing a new airstrip on Guadalcanal. Once completed, it would allow Japanese bombers to strike deep into Allied supply routes. For the Americans, that could not be allowed. On August 7, 1942, after months of hurried planning, the U.S. Marines of the 1st Division stormed ashore on Guadalcanal, the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. It was the beginning of a new phase in history, the moment when the United States, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, turned from defense to attack. The Japanese garrison, mostly construction troops and light infantry, was taken completely by surprise. Many fled into the jungle. By nightfall, the Marines had captured the unfinished airfield. They renamed it Henderson Field after a Marine pilot killed at Midway. For Tokyo, the news was shocking. The Americans, whom Japanese propaganda had portrayed as soft, decadent, and unwilling to fight, had just landed on territory claimed by the Empire. And they weren't leaving. The Imperial General Staff immediately ordered a counterattack. To the Japanese command, Guadalcanal was a minor tactical inconvenience. To the Americans, it was now sacred ground, but few in Tokyo understood what awaited their soldiers there. The island's jungle was a nightmare, a tangle of vines, mud, and disease. It rained constantly. Mosquitoes carried malaria. Leeches clung to skin. The soil turned to swamp with every downpour. Visibility was so poor that whole units disappeared in the foliage, never to be seen again. For Japanese soldiers trained to fight rapid, decisive battles, this was alien terrain. They were accustomed to victory through momentum, striking fast, moving faster, and finishing the fight before supply shortages could appear. But Guadalcanal would be a slow death. When the first Japanese reinforcements arrived by destroyer under the cover of night, the infamous Tokyo Express, they expected to drive the Americans into the sea within days. What they found instead were dug-in Marines, artillery zeroed in on every approach, and machine guns waiting in the dark. Still, the Imperial Army believed its spirit could overcome any obstacle. One Japanese soldier, their commanders declared, is worth 10 Americans. That faith would soon meet reality, in the mud, under the rain, and beneath the thunder of naval gunfire that never seemed to stop. Guadalcanal would become the first place where the myth of Japanese invincibility began to break, not in a single battle, but through endless days of hunger, terror, and exhaustion. The Japanese High Command viewed Guadalcanal as a temporary embarrassment, a small American intrusion that would be erased within weeks. Confidence was absolute. The Imperial Army had crushed every enemy it faced across Asia, From the jungles of Malaya to the plains of China, Japanese forces had advanced through sheer determination, discipline, and belief in their superiority. So when reports arrived that a few thousand U.S. Marines were holding a single airfield on a forgotten island, Tokyo reacted with fury, not fear. Reinforcements were ordered immediately. The 17th Army, under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, was tasked with retaking the island. But Hyakutake faced a reality that no amount of spirit could change. The nearest major Japanese base was at Rabaul, more than 600 miles away. Every man, bullet, and bag of rice would have to be delivered across seas now patrolled by American aircraft and submarines. The Imperial Navy, desperate to maintain control, began nightly supply runs known as the Tokyo Express. Fast destroyers would dash down the slot, the narrow channel between islands, unload men and supplies under darkness, and flee before daylight exposed them to American bombers. It was a daring system but deeply flawed. Each run could deliver only a fraction of what was needed. The Japanese soldiers who came ashore often carried little more than rifles and bayonets. No tents, no heavy weapons, and barely enough food to last a week. The Americans, meanwhile, were turning Henderson Field into a fortress. By late August, it was operational. From there, U.S. aircraft, the so-called Cactus Air Force, dominated the skies by day, striking any ship or troop column that appeared. Every Japanese attack was met with overwhelming firepower. Yet each failure only hardened the resolve of Tokyo's commanders. "We will throw them into the sea," declared Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, whose brigade arrived in September. To die here is the highest honor for the emperor. What followed was a series of assaults that bordered on suicidal. In the humid night of September 13th, Kawaguchi's men attacked the marine perimeter in waves, screaming "Banzai" as they charged through the jungle. But the Americans were ready. Flares illuminated the darkness, machine guns scythed through the trees, and mortars turned the undergrowth into fire. By dawn, nearly 1,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead before the American lines. It was the same pattern that would repeat for months, bravery colliding with overwhelming firepower. The Japanese soldiers fought with courage beyond question. But courage alone could not break through fortified lines supplied by sea and air every single day. For the men of the Imperial Army, the battle was becoming something far worse than defeat. It was starvation. The Tokyo Express brought bullets, but rarely food. Rice spoiled in the rain. Jungle rot destroyed clothing and flesh alike. Men collapsed from dysentery, malaria, and exhaustion. Soon they began to eat whatever they could find: roots, insects, even leather belts boiled in muddy water. Japanese field diaries found after the battle described the hunger madness. Soldiers wandered into the jungle, never returning. Entire units withered away without ever seeing the enemy. To the Americans, this suffering was invisible, hidden in the deep green of the jungle. But to the Japanese, it was daily reality. Guadalcanal had turned from a battle into a slow annihilation, and yet even as their ranks thinned, they refused to retreat. Orders from Tokyo were clear. The island must be retaken no matter the cost. For the Imperial Army, surrender was not an option. But every night, the sea glowed faintly red from distant naval gunfire, and every morning, the thunder of American artillery reminded them that the island was slipping away inch by inch. Guadalcanal was becoming a graveyard, not just for soldiers, but for the entire illusion of Japanese invincibility. Guadalcanal was more than a clash of armies. It was a clash of mindsets. The Japanese soldier had been raised in a culture where death for the emperor was the highest honor. From his first day of training, he was taught that surrender was worse than disgrace. It was unthinkable. The Americans, by contrast, fought not for divine destiny but for survival, for their comrades, their units, and their country. On Guadalcanal, those two philosophies collided in the mud. The Japanese infantryman carried little beyond a rifle, a bayonet, and belief. He had been trained to move quickly, strike hard, and finish battles in days, not months. But the island defied everything he knew. The jungle swallowed formations whole. The terrain erased strategy. Even the weather became an enemy. Sheets of tropical rain turning trails into rivers, and days of heat that made the air feel like boiling water. The Americans adapted. The Marines learned to fight with the jungle instead of against it. They used short-range ambushes, camouflage, and patrol tactics developed in the Philippines decades earlier. At night they dug deep, set up overlapping fields of fire, and waited. To the Japanese, these tactics were unnerving. They had been told the Americans would break easily. Yet here were men who endured without complaint, who fought silently and shot accurately, who seemed to have endless ammunition and food. Japanese soldiers began to call them teketsu, men of iron blood. For the Americans, it was also a lesson in brutality. They discovered that the Japanese would not surrender, even when surrounded. Wounded soldiers hid with grenades, waiting to explode when approached. Snipers tied themselves to trees, firing until killed. Prisoners were almost never taken alive. This fueled a deep, bitter hatred that hardened both sides. Guadalcanal was no longer a battle for territory. It had become a war of extermination, fought yard by yard through the jungle. By October, the Japanese launched their largest counteroffensive. Thousands of men moved through the dense vegetation, silent and determined. Their orders were simple: destroy Henderson Field at all costs. It was the same plan repeated again and again, a frontal assault against an entrenched enemy with superior firepower. At 22:01 on October 24th, the first wave attacked. Torrential rain fell as Japanese troops charged through waist-deep mud, their bayonets glinting in the flickering light of explosions. American artillery answered immediately. Shells tore through trees, sending shards of wood slicing like shrapnel. Whole companies disappeared into the darkness. By dawn, the attack had failed. Hundreds lay dead within a few hundred yards of the Marine lines. The survivors stumbled back into the jungle, starving, wounded, delirious. But the command in Tokyo, unaware of the true conditions, reported the operation as a success. For days, the newspapers celebrated a victory that never happened. Inside the jungle, the reality was silent horror. Japanese soldiers began dying faster from hunger than from bullets. Some collapsed beside streams, too weak to drink. Others drowned crossing flooded rivers. Disease spread unchecked. The stench of decay filled the air. Meanwhile, the Americans continued to grow stronger. Henderson Field was a living machine, its runways expanding, its supply lines constant. Every morning, the engines of Wildcats and Dauntless dive bombers filled the sky. Every night, American engineers worked under lantern light, repairing bomb damage and building new defenses. The Japanese could hear it from miles away, the constant hum of American machinery, the heartbeat of an army that never seemed to tire. To many Japanese soldiers, it was incomprehensible. They had been trained to fight short wars of movement and surprise, not prolonged campaigns of endurance. Their officers spoke of spirit over material, but spirit could not fill empty stomachs or stop malaria. In one surviving diary, a Japanese corporal wrote, "We no longer fear the enemy's bullets. We fear the hunger. We fear the jungle. We fear the sound of the airplanes." That single line captured what Guadalcanal had become, not a battle of courage, but of capacity. Every day the Japanese fought harder. Every night they fell farther behind. While soldiers on Guadalcanal battled hunger and exhaustion, far to the north the Imperial Navy fought its own desperate struggle. Every night, Japanese destroyers dashed down the narrow waters of the Solomon Islands, the route Allied sailors called the Slot. These runs, known to the Americans as the Tokyo Express, were feats of daring seamanship. But for the men aboard, each journey was a gamble with death. The destroyers carried food, ammunition, and reinforcements, and just as often, they returned with wounded men or none at all. Allied aircraft and submarines hunted them relentlessly. Each mission cost ships that Japan could not replace. Every success was smaller than the last. Despite these losses, Tokyo demanded more. "The Emperor's soldiers will not yield," radioed the 17th Army Command. "We will fight to the last man." But that promise masked a grim truth. The island was starving. By November 1942, the average Japanese soldier on Guadalcanal was surviving on fewer than 5 ounces of rice per day. Some units were reduced to eating grass, roots, and worms. Others turned to desperate measures, scavenging from the dead or looting the enemy's discarded rations. Even so, orders kept coming. Reinforcements would be sent. The Americans would be driven out. The Imperial Navy launched its boldest operation yet, a massive nighttime bombardment designed to annihilate Henderson Field and open the way for a final assault. On November 13th, the dark waters off Guadalcanal, erupted in one of the most chaotic naval battles of the war. Cruisers and destroyers from both sides collided in a close-range brawl, illuminated only by gunfire and burning wreckage. Ships rammed each other at point-blank range. Salvos were exchanged at less than 1,000 yards. Entire crews vanished in minutes. By dawn, the sea was littered with debris and bodies. Both sides had suffered heavily, but the Japanese had failed again. Henderson Field still stood. 2 nights later, they tried once more, and again the result was the same. The Imperial Navy's strength was bleeding away. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan's admirals began to admit what they had never imagined possible. They could no longer control the Pacific. Meanwhile, on land, the situation had become hopeless. Japanese soldiers were now dying faster from disease and starvation than from combat. Out of the tens of thousands sent to Guadalcanal, fewer than half remained alive by year's end. Many had become skeletons wrapped in tattered uniforms, too weak to carry rifles. When American patrols found their positions, they encountered silence, foxholes filled with the dead, trenches abandoned except for the smell of decay. The Americans, too, were suffering from fatigue and illness, but their supply lines never failed. Food, ammunition, and medicine arrived daily. New divisions replaced the exhausted. For every Japanese destroyer that dared the slot, a dozen American cargo ships steamed safely into port under air cover. The contrast was absolute. By December 1942, the Japanese High Command faced a decision that struck at the heart of its ideology. The Imperial Army had never abandoned a battlefield voluntarily. To withdraw from Guadalcanal was unthinkable, a disgrace. But to remain meant total annihilation. The debate in Tokyo was fierce. Some generals demanded one last offensive. Others argued that to waste men on a lost island would endanger the entire empire. The emperor's advisors finally intervened. On December 31, 1942, the order was given in secrecy. Guadalcanal would be evacuated. The withdrawal, codenamed Operation K, was one of the most carefully concealed operations of the war. Under the cover of darkness, Japanese destroyers once again raced down the slot, not to deliver reinforcements, but to rescue the survivors. Over 3 nights in February 1943, they evacuated nearly 11,000 men. Those who made it out were gaunt, diseased, and silent. They did not speak of victory or honor. They spoke of hunger, of ghosts in the jungle, of the endless hum of American planes. One naval officer later wrote, "We left our comrades behind, unburied. We left part of our soul on that island." Guadalcanal was more than a defeat. It was a mirror, one that showed Japan the true face of modern war. The empire that had swept through Asia on faith and ferocity had met an enemy that fought with endurance, industry, and numbers it could not match. The rising sun had begun to fade. The decision to abandon Guadalcanal was a secret wrapped in shame. For months, Tokyo had promised that the island would be retaken, that the emperor's soldiers were fighting heroically to destroy the American invaders. Newspapers published victory headlines. Radio broadcasts spoke of heavy U.S. losses. But behind the words, Japan's commanders were facing a grim reality. The island had become a cemetery. When Operation K began in early February 1943, most of the men left on Guadalcanal were already half dead. They were covered in sores, their uniforms shredded, their rifles rusted from rain. Many could no longer stand. Some had gone blind from malnutrition. Others were delirious with fever. The destroyers that came to rescue them did so in darkness, hugging the coastline under constant threat of air attack. Each night the men were loaded by the hundreds, silent, skeletal figures shuffling aboard, eyes hollow from months of starvation. For every soldier evacuated, another was left behind. In one account, a survivor described the final night. We could hear them calling from the jungle, the men who could not reach the shore. We heard their voices fade as the engine started. That sound has never left me. By dawn on February 9th, the last Japanese troops had slipped away. The island they had once called a stepping stone to Australia was now a monument to their endurance and their suffering. When American patrols advanced inland, they found nothing resembling an army. They found bones, makeshift graves, and diaries soaked in rain. One Marine wrote, "The jungle had eaten them alive." Out of roughly 36,000 Japanese troops sent to Guadalcanal, only about 11,000 escaped. The rest were killed, captured, or simply vanished. The Imperial General Staff called the withdrawal a strategic redeployment, but the truth was undeniable. Guadalcanal was the first major Japanese defeat of the war, the first time the rising sun had retreated. For the men who survived, the psychological impact was devastating. They had been raised on the Bushido code. To die was noble, to retreat was shameful. Yet here they were, alive when so many of their comrades were dead. Survivors of Guadalcanal often spoke of a deep, unshakable guilt. Not relief, but humiliation. Private diaries recovered after the war reveal the transformation in thought. One soldier wrote, "We believed the Emperor's light would never fade. But here we learned that faith cannot feed you and courage cannot stop a machine gun." Another simply wrote, "The jungle broke us. It took our honor and gave us hunger." Back in Tokyo, the military censored all news of the evacuation. The Japanese public was told that operations on Guadalcanal had achieved their objectives, and that forces had completed their mission. But whispers spread through the ranks. Soldiers across the Pacific heard what had really happened. They began to understand that the enemy they faced was unlike any other. The Americans did not fight for divine glory or imperial destiny. They fought with logistics, patience, and sheer persistence. They built airfields faster than Japan could destroy them. They repaired ships in weeks that took Japan months to replace. They had more fuel, more planes, more food, and above all, more time. The Japanese commanders knew it too. In private reports, General Hyakutake admitted, "We are no longer fighting the enemy army. We are fighting his factories." That realization marked the turning point not only of Guadalcanal, but of the entire Pacific War. From this point forward, Japan would never again be on the offensive. The initiative had passed irreversibly to the United States. Guadalcanal had stripped away the myth of invincibility that had driven Japan since Pearl Harbor. What remained was a nation still willing to die, but now aware that death would no longer change the outcome. In the months that followed, Japanese soldiers across the Pacific carried a quiet dread with them. They knew the Americans were coming, and they remembered the island where even faith had failed. For the first time, the rising sun had met a shadow it could not overcome. The fall of Guadalcanal struck Japan like a silent explosion. There was no public mourning, no broadcast of defeat. Only a change in tone, a tremor beneath the polished words of official reports. Behind closed doors, the men who had built the empire knew the truth. The war they had begun could no longer be won. In the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito listened to the staff summaries with measured calm. The report spoke of redeployment and temporary tactical setbacks. But when he asked how many men had been lost, the answer came as a whisper: tens of thousands. The emperor reportedly said nothing. His silence was heavier than any order. In the general staff offices in Tokyo, the atmosphere was tense, suffocating. Maps once marked with bright red arrows of conquest were now covered with defensive lines and circles of loss. The staff officers spoke quietly, almost reverently, about Guadalcanal, not as a battle but as a wound. General Tojo, Prime Minister and War Minister, demanded to know why the army had failed. The answers were as brutal as they were simple: hunger, disease, air power, logistics. For the first time, Japanese officers admitted aloud that the Americans possessed resources beyond calculation. They had entered the war believing that spirit could overcome material advantage. They left Guadalcanal understanding that belief itself was no longer enough. In naval circles, the loss was even more deeply felt. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Japan, had been bled dry. 6 major warships sunk, 24 damaged, and irreplaceable crews lost. The once invincible fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor was now fighting with fewer ships, less fuel, and diminishing hope. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's early victories, recognized what few dared to say: Guadalcanal marked the turning of the tide. In a letter to a confidant, he wrote, "We fought for 6 months with victory after victory, but if the war continues another year, I have no confidence in success." He would be dead 3 months later, his aircraft ambushed and shot down by American fighters, his fate sealed by the very dominance Guadalcanal had created. Among the soldiers who returned from the island, there were no victory parades, no songs, no glory. They arrived at Rabaul as ghosts, gaunt, silent men carrying diseases and trauma. Many refused to speak of what they had endured. Those who did were dismissed or shamed. To survive a defeat was to carry dishonor. a Japanese medic who escaped Guadalcanal, recalled, "When we reached Rabaul, we looked like walking corpses. We had lost everything, and our friends, our strength, our pride. The officers told us not to speak of the island again. The government suppressed all mention of Guadalcanal in the press, but rumors spread quickly among the ranks stationed throughout the Pacific. Soldiers whispered about the island where even faith had failed, where the emperor's men had starved while the Americans ate. That whisper became a shadow across every new battlefield. In New Guinea, the Aleutians, the Marshals, men went into combat carrying memories they had never experienced. Guadalcanal had become a warning. The psychological shift was profound. Before 1942, the Japanese soldier had believed in victory through sacrifice. After Guadalcanal, sacrifice became the only thing left to offer. From that realization grew the desperate tactics that would define the rest of the war. The banzai charges, the kamikaze pilots, the refusal to surrender. They were not born from confidence, but from the knowledge that conventional victory was impossible. Meanwhile, in Washington, the mood was entirely different. Guadalcanal had proven what America could do when it decided to fight. It was no longer a question of whether Japan could be stopped, only how long it would take. Factories in the United States were producing aircraft and ships faster than Japan could count them. The island campaign had turned the Pacific into a conveyor belt of men, machines, and momentum. Back in Japan, the shock sank deeper with every passing week. The empire's propaganda continued, but its believers were fewer. Even among the public, the sense of invincibility was gone. Mothers received letters from sons who would never return. Factories worked through the night under the drone of air raid drills. The population began to understand quietly and without words that the war they had been told was divine had turned human and hopeless. Guadalcanal was not only the loss of an island. It was the loss of an illusion, the belief that willpower alone could overcome the modern world. For the first time, Japan looked into the mirror of defeat and saw the future reflected back. Endless retreat, inevitable ruin, and the long shadow of surrender waiting beyond the horizon. After Guadalcanal, the Japanese empire began to shrink. Slowly at first, then all at once. The defeat had changed everything, even if Tokyo refused to admit it publicly. The once celebrated map of conquests that filled every classroom now became a record of targets the Allies intended to take back one by one. Before Guadalcanal, Japan's armies had chosen where to fight. After Guadalcanal, they fought wherever the enemy came. In early 1943, the Imperial General Staff abandoned plans for further expansion in the South Pacific. The focus shifted to fortifying what they already held, building airfields, bunkers, and defensive rings across thousands of islands. Every one of them was called an unsinkable fortress. Everyone would eventually fall. The withdrawal from Guadalcanal forced Tokyo to confront an impossible truth. Japan's industrial base simply could not match America's. The loss of ships, aircraft, and men could not be replaced at the same rate. Where the United States built 10 carriers, Japan built 1. For every tank Japan produced, America rolled out 50. The empire was bleeding faster than it could heal. Even the once mighty Imperial Navy was showing cracks. The destruction of its elite air crews during the Guadalcanal Campaign had left a hole that could never be filled. The pilots who had trained for years before the war were gone, replaced by young, inexperienced aviators rushed through shortened courses. The precision that had once defined the Japanese carrier arm was disappearing. On land, the situation was worse. Guadalcanal had swallowed the core of the 17th Army. The soldiers who survived were scattered across the Pacific to rebuild new garrisons. Weary, haunted men now defending instead of conquering. They became the instructors of a new generation of troops passing down not glory, but warnings. One Japanese officer who had fought on Guadalcanal later told his recruits in New Guinea, "The Americans are not like us. They do not stop. They bring the world with them. If you fight them, fight knowing that you will die." That quiet fatalism began to infect the entire Imperial Army. Meanwhile, the Americans pushed forward, island by island. In the Central Pacific, the battles of Tarawa, Kwajalein, and Saipan would repeat Guadalcanal's lesson with deadlier precision. Each assault was preceded by days of bombardment, followed by waves of infantry, engineers, and machines, a relentless pattern that the Japanese could not break. Tokyo's newspapers still spoke of glorious resistance. But the letters sent home told a different story. Soldiers starving, living in holes, waiting for ships that never came. For the families of the men lost on Guadalcanal, there was little closure. Most never received confirmation of death, only a line in an official notice. Fell in battle in the southern area. The truth, starvation, disease, or madness, it was too shameful to print. Strategically, Guadalcanal marked the moment Japan's war plan inverted. The empire that had grown by striking suddenly and retreating safely now found itself encircled. American submarines prowled the shipping lanes, cutting off oil from the Dutch East Indies and raw materials from Malaya. Each convoy sunk meant fewer planes, fewer tanks, fewer chances, and yet Japan continued to fight. The Bushido spirit that had carried its soldiers across Asia now became a shield against despair. To fight to the last man was not just a duty. It was the only way left to pretend the empire still had meaning. But inside the minds of those who had been to Guadalcanal, the illusion was gone. They knew what awaited on every island: hunger, isolation, annihilation. Guadalcanal had become a prophecy, replayed again and again across the Pacific. Every new battle was a smaller version of the same story: courage crushed beneath steel, honor drowned by logistics, and faith buried under the ruins of modern war. By 1944, the empire that had once stretched from the jungles of Burma to the islands of the Central Pacific was collapsing in on itself. The spirit of Guadalcanal haunted every command post, every soldier, every decision. What had begun as a single defeat had grown into a truth too vast to ignore. Japan could no longer win. The Imperial Army, once built for lightning conquest, was now forced into static defense. Its generals rewrote doctrine around one principle: fight to the last man. If victory was impossible, death was preferable to surrender. The lessons of Guadalcanal were not forgotten. They were inverted. Instead of adapting to modern war, Japan turned inward, embracing death as strategy. In bunkers and trenches from Saipan to Iwo Jima, Japanese officers spoke of gyokusai, the honorable death of shattered jewels. It was the transformation of defeat into ritual, survival into shame. This mindset, born from the humiliation of Guadalcanal, would define Japan's last 2 years of war. The empire no longer sought triumph. It sought meaning in destruction. For many soldiers, Guadalcanal had shown them what dying for the emperor actually looked like. Not glorious charges, but slow starvation and isolation. Yet even that horror became mythologized. Military newspapers described the Guadalcanal garrison as the divine dead who turned the tide of destiny. The truth, that they were abandoned and broken, was buried beneath ceremony. Inside Japan, reality was beginning to break through the cracks. Food shortages spread across the home islands. Air raid drills replaced parades. The public, though still fed victory slogans, sensed the change. Mothers no longer wrote letters of pride, they wrote prayers for survival. Factories turned out weapons while the sound of distant sirens echoed through the night. In the war colleges, younger officers studied the reports from Guadalcanal with quiet dread. They saw the pattern: the loss of air superiority, the starvation, the logistical collapse. They knew it would happen again. Yet no one dared suggest surrender. Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, one of the few who spoke frankly, warned in 1944, "We have been defeated not by courage, but by machinery. We can no longer build the war we wish to fight." He was right. The Allies now possessed overwhelming strength: aircraft carriers that darkened the horizon, bombers that reached Japan itself, and submarines that strangled every shipping lane. Each new island captured brought the enemy closer to Tokyo. The ghosts of Guadalcanal followed them. Veterans of the campaign, now stationed on other islands, recognized the signs: the hunger, the isolation, the slow tightening of the noose. They called it the Guadalcanal disease. It was not a medical condition, but a realization: the certainty of death without victory. By the time the Americans reached Saipan in mid-1944, Japan's leaders already knew the end was approaching. The fall of Saipan placed U.S. bombers within range of the home islands. Yet even then, the government told its people to prepare for 100 million glorious deaths. The lessons of Guadalcanal, the futility of sacrifice against overwhelming power, were ignored. replaced by national suicide disguised as honor. The defeat at Guadalcanal had shown that Japan's greatest enemy was not the United States, but modernity itself. The empire's faith in willpower and purity had met an age ruled by steel, oil, and calculation. When the war finally ended in August 1945, and the emperor spoke to his people for the first time, his words were calm, almost resigned. We must endure the unendurable. For the men who had fought at Guadalcanal, those words carried a different meaning. They had already endured the unendurable, the jungle, the hunger, the knowledge that the rising sun could set. Guadalcanal had been the first crack in the empire's armor. From that fracture, the whole edifice eventually fell. When the jungle of Guadalcanal finally fell silent, the war still raged elsewhere. But Japan was already changed forever. The island had devoured its armies, its illusions, and its pride. It had revealed with terrible clarity that courage without supply is suicide, and that faith cannot feed an empire. For the Japanese soldier, Guadalcanal was not just a defeat. It was a revelation. The moment he realized that the war could not be won by will alone. In the endless rain and the sound of unseen engines overhead, he discovered that modern war belonged to those who could build, not only to those who could die. One officer, years later, described it simply: on that island, the Emperor's army met America and met the future. We were still fighting the last war. They were already fighting the next. Guadalcanal became more than a place on a map. It was a lesson carved into the soul of a nation. It marked the beginning of Japan's long descent from conquest to catastrophe, from the arrogance of invincibility to the humility of survival. When peace finally came, the veterans who had lived through that green hell rarely spoke of it. There was no honor to recall, no victory to celebrate, only the memory of rain, hunger, and ghosts. In the decades that followed, Japan would rise again, not as a conqueror, but as a builder. The same discipline that once marched into jungles would rebuild cities, factories, and lives. Yet beneath that quiet rebirth, the echo of Guadalcanal remained, a reminder of how quickly glory can dissolve into ruin, and how the measure of a nation is not in how it conquers, but in how it endures what it has destroyed.